Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Immersive Tech Talk podcast series presented by VRD Health Tech. I'm Sherry Marion, CEO of VRD Health Tech, and we're so pleased to have our host, Professor Skip Rizzo, who will be engaging in dialogue with various experts in the digital mental health field across the course of the podcast series. Professor Rizzo will interview today's amazing guests and VRD partners, Amir Bozorgzadeh and Hossein Jalali, co-founders of Virtuleap. Before we start the discussion, let me introduce you to VRD Health Tech. VRD Health Tech is an accelerator for the adoption of immersive technology by partnering with wonderful emerging brands like Virtuleap to market, sell, onboard, and train users in health and wellness solutions. We offer these applications to hospitals, clinics, educators, and corporations to benefit their patients, students, clients, and their community. VRD is proud to have the support and guidance from experts in virtual reality, such as our host, Professor Skip Rizzo. Skip Rizzo is a professor at USC and director of medical virtual reality. He serves as an advisor and chief science officer for our partner, Cognitive Leap, exploring methods to address attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, in children. Joining Dr. Rizzo today is Amir Bozorgzadeh. Amir is co-founder and CEO at Virtuleap, the company that combines neuroscience with VR to address cognitive disorders and learning challenges. Previous to Virtuleap, Amir founded Game Guys, a mobile game studio based in Dubai, and Time Durham, the first social impact startup to introduce time banking to the Middle East. Amir has been a contributing writer to tech blogs like VentureBeat and TechCrunch on the topics of emerging tech and startup ecosystems. Hossein Jalali is co-founder and CTO at Virtuleap, bringing over 22 years of digital experience to the forefront of healthcare technology. He is known for raising the standards in VR development, who, along with his team at Virtuleap, are recognized for their powerful and scalable products that are transforming the industry. Previous to Virtuleap, Hossein was co-founder at Lisbon-based fitness search and discovery startup FlexPass, which was acquired by Urban Sports in 2018. During the interview, our participants who are joining from the webinar can directly ask a question through the Q&A window, while participants from the YouTube live stream can also ask questions in the live chat. We will have around 10 minutes at the end to ask your questions. So now let's turn it over to Skip, Amir, and Hossein.
Okay, guys. I've been looking forward to this podcast for quite some time. I've gotten to know you over the last 4 or 5 years through the work. And I just have to say the work is near and dear to my heart. I mean, you are doing cutting edge research and development in the area of cognitive assessment and cognitive training. And this is actually why I got into virtual reality in the first place. You know, a clinical neuropsychologist working in brain injury rehab back in the 90s, and very frustrated with the tools that we had available to us at the time. And I ended up leaving clinical practice once I learned about virtual reality, with the vision that we would be able to do things better in these simulated environments to better measure cognitive and functional abilities, and possibly be able to rehabilitate some of those functions in people after a traumatic brain injury, a stroke, or some other neurological condition, and so on. And I just got to say, the vision that I had in the mid 90s that caused me to leave clinical work and go to USC is exactly what you guys are doing right now. You know, you're building. I'm not going to say everything. I'm going to leave that to you guys to talk about it. But it's really impressive, because a lot of people have tried doing this over the years, but I think you've finally hit the sweet spot with developing game-based brain exercises, activities, assessment tools, and really doing it at a high level. So with that little intro, let me, you guys can take turns. You can fight over who goes first, but I want to hear what was the turning point? What got you into this? What made you think that VR was something where you could make a difference for people using this technology?
I think I'll start with saying if that's cool with you. I usually do. I butt in first in the CEO kind of role, and then Hossein actually supports whatever I promise by getting it done. Um, we actually worked together, Hossein and I, before Virtuleap for I think close to 4 years in a mobile game studio that we were running. Even created one particular game, but we were really publishing a lot of titles in the Middle East when we were both based in Dubai. And then I had been participating in a sort of incubator that got me into eventually discovering the VR sector in its, I guess, third or fourth wave, estimating from how far back you've been involved, Skip, and seeing the different cycles. But at that point, I started wanting to understand how I could get in there with a mobile games development and publishing background, no real right or stake in the business. I started writing for VentureBeat and TechCrunch, covering virtual reality, also some forms of augmented reality, and trying to interview every expert I could find across all of the different sectors and find out what the critical use cases were. In the middle of that journey, I discovered an experience created by a Paris studio called Birdly, which allows you basically, it simulates with some actual custom tech that makes you go into a bird sort of custom VR device with wings and everything. And I was flying on top of New York City, and I remember my wife had to come over to me because when that simulation turned on, I forgot to breathe because I have a phobia of heights. And that experience, she was basically like, breathe, breathe. And by that, about 5 minutes into it, I'm able to go from complete freeze phobia mode to actually like accelerating flight. Like the exposure therapy was just tremendous. And that was the germ that got me to venture into creating Virtuleap and then pulling Hossein into the adventure till we could do this together.
Was it my turn?
It's your turn.
Fire away.
Yeah, I think one of the things that me and Amir early on realized was that I come from an agency background, so development has always been part of my experience. And the first thing that really struck me was how much potential VR has and how bad the content is. And basically it all seemed to be like people who were just testing. Not a lot of real serious stuff was being made, and I think that's where we kind of like decided, me and Amir, to build something, but not just build something with good standards of design, good standards of development, and just bring in a quality that VR should have. And from day one, we've spent effort, and we put a lot of effort into making sure that we do things right, and that's the area that I really wanted to emphasize on. Beyond that, the idea of the human brain, I think, was interesting for both Amir's side and from my side, just because my son has like a very strange characteristic in terms of learning to read and write very early on in his life. When he was 2, he was reading. He was reading Dr. Seuss books when he was 3, but from different aspects, he had areas that he needed more help. And the human brain became interesting to both me and my wife. So VR seemed to be like the great option because you could put the human into a situation that you would want them to be without them necessarily having to be exposed to that in real life. And we just thought that this is a great opportunity for us to really look at it from a data perspective. And I think that's where I found a lot of interest in VR.
It's very interesting because Amir, your experience came from actually trying VR and having it address something in a way that you didn't expect, your fear of heights. Whereas Hussein, yours came about from, almost a personal experience in wanting to understand the brain better, but also having the chops to be able to build this stuff and understand what its needs are. And I just find it, I always like hearing the origin stories of why people got into this, because it's a very special group, people that develop VR. They're sometimes rebels, sometimes rogues, sometimes very astute scientists that see that vision and so on. I'm wondering, in this particular area, certainly, Amir, your story talks about how we can fool the brain. Even though you knew you were in a VR simulation, your body reacted to it as if it was the real thing. And I'm wondering how that informs the reasons for developing cognitive training and assessment tools. How did that inform Virtuleap's mission to create these tools? And maybe describe a little bit about what these tools involve.
Sure. I always describe it as digital sorcery. I mean, I go ahead and I say you're hijacking parts of the human experience, the parts that we're usually unconscious of, right? Like if I was in a simulation where I'm on this call with you, but I see that I'm standing on a plank and there's like 20 stories down, the part of my body that doesn't realize that's not real. It doesn't equate. Like it's not the human experience is multidimensional, and many of those dimensions we're unaware of, unconscious of, and yet they have such a profound influence on so many of the challenges that we face in terms of everything that impedes or we excel at in our daily life. A lot relates to those dimensions, the unconscious parts, the experiential parts, the emotional parts, not just the one that I think is a quite limited aspect of our perception and our identity. VR triggers all of those areas, and like I say, hijacks them into believing the experience is real. I think Brennan Spiegel was one of the individuals that really inspired me early on. In one of his lectures, he was talking about how the eyes, our visual sense, is like the master sense, and when you trick that sense, all the other kind of subsenses are like, this is how the sorcery happens. They just, that's why pain management in VR is so effective, because pain receptors in the brain significantly dampen when someone's in a VR simulation that isn't in the setting in which that pain exists. So cognition, is it just one aspect of these categories that we're always kind of in the most limited way evaluating someone's cognition, or do we need to have a embodied digital format that is engaging multiple more dimensions of us, not just in terms of engagement, but in terms of even the data collection? Virtual reality to me is ultimately the only medium to initially come out. I mean, I'm sure extended reality, AR, that's all part of the same spectrum, but this is the one that actually is native to the human UX, this ecosystem. So it's the one to assess, it's the one to be a therapy.
I think it's very important you mentioned about the visuals being the master sense in some way. I've always said this about our PTSD exposure therapy work, that the visuals set a stage. They put a person in a place where they can begin to confront and reprocess difficult trauma memories. But you can't underestimate the importance of the other senses for making the experience real. So you standing on that plank 20 stories up, you got the visuals, that three-dimensional view of depth and activating that fear. But if you hit a button and all of a sudden you hear the sound of maybe wind going by, all of a sudden you're even more up there. And if you're walking on the plank and you're on a platform that vibrates a little bit, now you got a tactile sense as you're walking on this plank, looking under there, hearing the wind and feeling the vibratory stimulation that might happen when you're walking on a plank. And that's how you build an experience. A lot of times we talk about the simulations specifically, but what we're doing is we're experience crafting. We're building experiences, and hopefully for in an informed, theoretically informed and research informed fashion to address whatever clinical process, like you mentioned with Brennan's work with pain management, and now the work you're doing with cognitive functioning. And so Hussein, how maybe you can describe a little bit more about um, the, the plan for the enhanced program, the Virtuleap enhanced program, which was really the game-based cognitive training activities. You know, you've integrated sound, of course, and interaction and, you know, really compelling videos that are responsive to people. But what got you to that point to seeing that? What were some of the advantages and challenges you faced in creating that for those first environments that eventually grew into what you got, like what, almost 20 different types of unique activities now?
So I think we were always fascinated by the 2D versions of what there is out there in terms of brain training in a sense, and we quickly, like, just looking at it, I always come up with this example that's not very scientifically correct. It's the juggling app. If you download a juggling app on your phone and you're the best at it, you're no closer to being a juggler. But with VR, you actually get the brain and body involved, at least emotions are there. And this is not scientifically matching, but it kind of paints the picture. And we're like, okay, with VR, we have a lot of different senses that we can bring into. Beyond that, you're not sitting in your bathroom doing two other things and doing this at the same time. You're actually in the environment and you're actually doing that, which allows us to really evaluate you, because your 100% is on this at all times. So it's not one time 30%, one time 70%. And once we start looking at it from that perspective, we also realize that, okay, when the body is involved, suddenly we have a lot more data that we're collecting. There's so much more that can be collected. And with that data that's being collected, we can actually come up with scenarios that are not just 0 and 1, but there's a spectrum between 0 and 1. So like if we ask you to memorize 10 different animals and tell us what the fifth one is, and you say it's a bear, okay, you said it's a bear and you said it quickly, but the next person comes in and starts thinking and looking around. We're tracking your eyes, we're tracking your body movement, so we know that even if you say bear at the end, the bear that you just said is very different than the bear that the first person said, because there's so much more data that we've collected about you, and we know that you didn't say this with the same confidence level. And so that is just one example of how we're trying to gather so much more data. And every single game that we're trying to build is built around, you know, science being the first pillar of what that is. And I think just thinking about it outside of all of that, just as a normal person who may not even like be very scientifically looking at it, it makes sense to you that, you know, when your body is involved, when you're inside an immersed environment where everything is moving and your eyes are moving, your body is moving, your hands are moving, and everything is being tracked, we can understand who you are at this very moment much better and who you're becoming over time. And
A lot
so
of people
that's what.
talk about embodied cognition, you know, and the idea that when you interact in a real context on a cognitive challenge and your body is involved, that you know, we call this experiential learning, maybe. It's a distillation of that, but that the cognitive learning takes place in a more enduring fashion. And I think that's part of what you're saying here, as opposed to clicking a mouse button and responding to a set of stimuli on a flat screen. You're actually physically involved in the action. And I think that's an important element for what VR adds to the mix when it comes to cognitive rehabilitation. There's always been challenges in brain training. You know, it's almost a bad term to use sometimes. Um, you know, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with it, but the idea of fostering interaction that's more like what the challenges of the real world would present to you, I think is one of the major features. And I think your applications, you know, really leverage that component, and foster a higher likelihood that what's learned in VR is going to translate to the real world, where you're physically interacting in the real world. You're being driven by whatever cognitive function is being leveraged at that time, but you're acting. I mean, you know, look at reading a book. It's a deep cognitive function. All you're doing is turning pages. But in everyday functional activities that are often the focus of rehabilitation, to improve that in somebody after some type of central nervous system, damage or insult. That is a key element, that engaged embodied activity. Well, which one of you guys want to describe what the enhanced program involves, what the activities are that are in this world? And I think when we post this on YouTube, we'll probably have a couple links to some of the demo videos so people can view what the content looks like as well.
Yeah. Well, the Enhanced VR, the flagship product, the one we're known for, and we have a second product coming up. But Enhanced VR, it is a library of 15 cognitive exercises designed by our in-house neuroscientists to essentially evaluate, to also be serving as a therapeutic, but the evaluation of your cognitive strengths and weaknesses across about 22 different cognitive functions that, again, include spatial orientation for the first time, motor control skills for the first time, spatial audio awareness, a lot of these categories that we consider to be cognitive that and included in the library and included in the whole scoring system, everything, they're considered cognitive
what are some of the
indicators.
processes that you're measuring? Memory, obviously.
Yes, where we go from one of our long-term memory to short-term memory, up to information processing, to problem solving, flexibility, speed, and then comes the more motor control oriented categories that are much more experimental, spatial orientation that simply do not have historical examples for us to follow. We have to tread into that ourselves. And what Hossein has done, I mean, maybe Hossein, you should mention, one of the things that I think people don't understand is getting an app like this out there on an app store available is one thing. That's great. But the back end that Hossein and the team have created to make the whole thing interconnected in a scoring system that is proprietary and experimental, and yet brings the body and mind all together in one cohesive system. I was saying, if you can just kind of describe some of that under the water glacier.
Yeah. So, building in VR and building it in a good quality is a difficult task because you're basically trailblazing in many areas of development. It's not building a website where if you run into a problem, you Google that problem and 300 other people have had that issue. With VR, it's you and yourself. And even at point, it's not even you. It's the SDK that comes with the device that either doesn't support what you need or is just not working properly. So our team spent quite a huge amount of time learning on their own and building on their own in many ways. So that's the VR aspect. But on the back end aspect, we put a lot of effort into making sure that we collect as much data as we can so that we have built a proper data system that stores this, data lakes where we can gather data and then communicate with that data. We try to make sure that there's nothing missing. So we went way beyond a lot of data points that may never be useful, but we decided that we want to gather them. We gather information like the XYZ coordinates of your controller and your headset on rotation basis on a frame per second. And we don't necessarily turn that on, but it's there. And because we want to be able to track minute changes in you, because change has very different meanings, right? A simple change is like your score was 11 and now you can't pass level 7. Of course, there's something wrong with you. And that's a simple change. But we're looking at very small changes. A change could be when we do memory techniques, we all have a strategy in our head to do certain things. And just change of strategy is something we want to find in you. So like you used to start from the up top right corner. Now you're starting from the bottom left corner. That's a change in you. You used to find 4 or 5 items that are matching and you select them first before going to the outliers. But now you're starting with outliers. So we're trying to find minute changes in people, and even a change could be shaky hands. And so we wanted to make sure that gathering data was done well. And then beyond that, we have a remote control. We have a tool that I think, Amir, you want to explain that a little bit more. And we have a lot of different things that we've also created, not for the person who's actually using the VR, but for people who are trying to help that person have the right experience.
Yeah, I mean, the remote control, it's a can of worms to talk about some of the enterprise features and everything we're doing commercially and why we're B2B and why we're enterprise. It really goes down to the history of also some of the OEMs or powers that be like Meta, who have been so phenomenally. I mean, they're the market makers. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't exist. But at the same time, they have always had a particular agenda of, zombie killing in VR has a higher priority than anything that is about, transcending the human experience. I mean, we to this day, they're just about to change it a little bit, but I think 4 years too late. I think we've had to be Rocky Balboa style, cockroaches, surviving through whatever means we can to get to the types of providers out there like hospitals and clinics who I think desperately need us, especially now, need us to be available as an application. But we've never been really available on the consumer app store on Meta. I mean, in fact, being ignored by emails and so on. So what we really did early on is focus on hospitals, focus on enterprise clients, and who are typically also our research partners at the end of the day. And by working closely with them for the last 4 or 5 years, to the closest degree, back and forth testing and user design, accessibility, maximizing accessibility to the highest level you can imagine, where we have to be able to anticipate adapting our games to whether someone is mobility restricted in a wheelchair or has, let's say, epilepsy or needs the colorblind settings to be adapted for font sizes. All these things we have to do. So the development curve that Hossein and the team have kind of developed, I mean, it's way shorter in some ways, but what they've learned in how to do it properly, that takes time. It's called VR development hell for very good reason, because of all those aspects that a lot of developers ignore. But one of the things we developed as a side tool for our clinical partners is this remote control application that you load up on your tablet, for example, and you can basically remote navigate the whole experience for the user and adjust all those accessibility settings, really log them in, navigate it for them in a seamless way, which is really, really useful, if you can imagine, for sensitive populations, or let's say people with certain therapeutic categories, like the Alzheimer's, going all the way to that degree, or individuals with intellectual disability, where in all those categories we're working across those areas, and this remote control app is so key for clinicians.
Yeah, because I just want to add one thing really quick, is because when the reality of the VR experience is not just what you built, it's from the beginning when they put the headset on and how easy it is to put it on till they reach the point where they actually use your tool. And, building a Guardian is actually a process, and doing a lot of certain aspects to reach where you are is a challenge. And by the time they've reached to the point where they actually need to do your experience, they've already made up their mind that they don't like this, for example. And so we want to kind of like take that away and make sure that when they're in, everything goes well, and they're now in a stable position where they only experience what they're supposed to experience and be assessed on. Just wanted to add that on top of it.
I think that's extremely important, the usability, and really, as I like to call it, all the unsexy parts of VR development. I mean, when people go into this, they have a vision and they want to build this really cool world, and they don't really appreciate, well, it's more than just, the visual experience of a cool environment. What are you going to do in that environment? How are you going to measure it? How are you going to make it usable to somebody with a cognitive impairment or a physical impairment? And how do you integrate clinicians into the mix so that we're not replacing clinicians with this? We're providing them with a tool to enhance their skills, to be able to do something that just, I'm always thinking about, is this a harebrained scheme? Can we do this just as well with paper and pencil or regular flat screen computer stuff? And I just keep coming back to the same point. No, there is so much more that goes on in a 3D, immersive, ecologically relevant environment that there should be no shame. So my next question is, what's the response? Well, all right, my next question. I have another question before that, but I'll go to the next one since I'm on this roll. What is the response of neuropsychologists, clinicians, rehabilitation specialists? What do they tell you about this? It's obvious that you have partnerships where you're getting this feedback, but what's the view from the people in the trenches that work with these clients?
You imagine what it was like maybe on our first 6 months to the first year of development. And you look at that version, at least I do. We have some teaser videos on our YouTube from back then, and it will make my eyes bleed, just looking at it, especially, you know, um, how the improvements you get adjusted to them. You see how the team creates things now at the first go. They've learned all those lessons. So, whichever practitioners we worked with at those periods, we've always targeted champions in the sector. Like David Pennington at the VA, huge rock star person who has been trying to put in VR into their sector. So we target people who are already sort of, it's not their first rodeo, trying to bring immersive tech into those spaces. But the ones that maybe are new to them, but they're very curious, during those early days, they would have been the ones who we had to kind of work really closely with. They would have had a tolerance for the bugs and issues as we kept on learning. If you consider who we meet now from day one and what they get to access and the whole suite of things and all the fixes that have gone into it, it's the Ferrari of our sector of cognitive, therapeutics, or even the somewhat I think sullied industry term of brain training to some degree. But we are the Ferrari of that sector because of what we are now, because of what we learned. In terms of when we work with those research partners, even in the earliest days, and we try to do certain forays into seeing therapeutic value for ADHD, or as perhaps a new gold standard for cognitive assessment. In every case, even if you have any university create crappy VR, I've never seen where VR versus a 2D version of it, if it comes into cognitive domains, it doesn't have higher levels of engagement. And that means higher levels of quality of data. And often, if they just focus on this one thing, if they have the luxury to, when you remove the examiner from the room and the influence that examiner has on a person's performance, actually. I was at a hospital partner site a couple of weeks ago for the new product, the VR screener we're about to release in the fall. And they were saying actually the same person was doing a standard test, the 2D test, neuropsychological evaluation during the morning, and then again they did it later in the evening, and the test was different. And they came down to the point that it was the different examiners in the room that influenced also some of the changes. So
yeah,
multivariate.
that's been common in common observation. Forgetting the term they use for it, but how people perform differently when they're being observed, behavioral inhibition or facilitation kinds of things. I think that's very important. You mentioned the assessment end. I'd like to spend a few minutes on that because I think this is an area where I think, well, I've always been inspired by it. And I always like to say it's easier to measure people than it is to fix them. But that's not necessarily true because there's a lot of work in measurement to develop really well done psychometric assessments. But can you guys tell us a little bit about the Cognitive Clear application that you're putting out, and what's the target, the mission, the potential for expansion to other populations other than the initial population you intended, and what it involves?
Like with Enhanced VR, about I think 4 months ago, we launched a cognitive assessment report that even with playing these games, you would get some benchmark scores that would give you a map, or it would give you a report that would serve as a cognitive fingerprint of you. Like I know that my spatial orientation skills in that scoring is really subpar, and it makes complete sense to my wife that I cannot navigate any small town in Italy. She thinks that I'm doing it on purpose. Now I can give her this report and go, no, I have a deficit here. Do you see this? Does it make sense to you? So even that report for Enhanced VR is a sort of assessment. But when we talk about the second product, it really is a screening tool for an area that throughout all these years working with hospital partners, we kept on revisiting this point that Alzheimer's and cognitive impairment, MCI, mild cognitive impairment, even subjective cognitive decline, that area is so underserved with tools that can be able to give evaluators something to offer individuals to be able to, let's say, detect that there's actually a cognitive deficit, and this is a pointer to a neurologist, let's say, that this person should look into something to address their condition. Often we see in that world is that people have a huge taboo towards cognitive evaluation. People are I think Bill Gates said it, the thing that scares him the most is when his brain stops working. I think there's a stigma towards going to MRI scans. I'm a little claustrophobic too, Skip, so I need a VR solution for that. But we need to create non-invasive, non-scary sorts of screening tools, and that's what CogniClear is going to be, a 30-minute independent examiner independent tool that I think will be a gold standard for cognitive screening.
And this was inspired by traditional methods a little bit, like the mini mental or the with the Montreal type test, and that's really the purpose. Or
Exactly. Like, basically, I don't think I've met a neuroscientist or neurologist or cognitive scientist who's ever said a kind word of any of the standardized tests that are out there. And so we're creating something actually, dare I say, a little sexy for the industry across that area, that actually is something that people aren't like, aghast at when they have to complete some 90-minute evaluation in a clinical setting. It's inspired by all the standardized tests. But of course, again, when you take something from 2D and bring it into 3D, into VR, you have to really start to create your own kind of rule books of how you create something with an extra dimension. And lots of back and forth testing with our hospital partners. With Luciadas in Lisbon, Portugal, we literally worked with them for 2.5 years, back and forth, testing, redesign. We never cut any corners. So it's a very long process of, yes, bringing in traditional inspirations, but of having to, change and remodel and invent and innovate as you kind of move step by step.
Two quick questions. Hussein, maybe you can talk about the protection of privacy with all this data flying around. And then I want to dig in and talk about applications for children, the stuff that you've developed, the translation of this for kids. But Hussein,
Yeah, absolutely.
privacy.
So in terms of privacy, we've been working very closely from the beginning with very industry leaders. Particularly when we were building our architecture, we considered a lot of aspects, like trying to stay HIPAA compliant, GDPR, etc., segregating what's considered identifiable information, personal identifiable information, and separating that from gameplay data. And then we're making sure that the gameplay data is something that's reasonably more accessible, while the information related to that particular person is not. The good part about what we do is we're basically not necessarily doing anything but gameplay. So we're actually just gathering data that's related to gameplay, but we have been like, security has always been very important from day one, and we actually put the extra effort because a lot of startups usually, they start easier and then later on make it more advanced. They do the wrong thing and then ask for forgiveness. We from day one have been doing it the right way as much as we possibly could. Of course, there's been learning. We learned a lot from working with the team in AWS and making adjustments accordingly. We're at a point where even right now, like when we were working with different countries, different regions, they have different compliances, and so we're breaking down data in a way that personal information can be stored within data banks within their own country. A lot of them want it. Europe needs data to stay in Europe. India needs data to stay in India. So we've actually built infrastructure where we can have certain data that's important to stay there. And so, it's an onion full of layers, and these layers have to keep being added onto it. So you never say that we're 100% secure. We're 100% secure at this moment, and we're constantly trying to be better. And we're trying to learn, and things change, and we have to be ready to make those adjustments according to the new policies and requirements that come in. But we're at a good place when it comes to security because we implemented it as a core within our development right from the start.
So what about kids now? I know that you're partnering with VRD on potential applications of translation of this that, for teenagers and adults and everything. But what about children? Do you see any barriers with the development that you have already with a relatively rapid, but maybe some customization around children? Because I know some of the content that you have is very, I think as a kid, I would have loved with it. But what do you guys see on that front?
We, you know, at one point we were following Meta, for example, had a regulation of you need to be 13 years old, and so we kind
No,
of
it's
shied away
10.
from even now it's 10. And so, for example, we have a study happening with a Spanish partner, 160 children between 10 up to 16, so teenagers, and it's really focused on ADHD, executive function as the bullseye category. We did an ADHD study more on the university students a couple of years ago, finding that we could increase processing speed. A lot of our focus this year is on, in fact, youth and youth ADHD in particular. More or less, I've kind of decided with Hossein that our stake in the ground is because we can work with so many partners across so many therapeutic areas and so many different populations, and we have to find a way to make our stuff available to any kind of group, in a DIY kind of way. Come in and just set up a SaaS kind of account. But our stake in the ground is ADHD and youth. And every time we've worked with in workshops or little small studies, children, and in fact, are the ones, I guess, that, like you say and you allude to, the games appeal to the most, because it really is like a gym for the mind. And they're kind of, I think, at a point where they're open enough to that kind of new concept where we don't have to teach them the need for that. It kind of is very intuitive for the youth population, in fact.
Hmm. Well, in part of my work with a company, Cognitive Leap, another Leap company, with the virtual classroom for ADHD assessment and so on, we've had to deal with this issue because we've tested kids from age 6 up to 13. And, part of documenting that work, I looked up all the literature on near eye displays with children and use of VR headsets. And the American Ophthalmic Society has, come out in a position paper and a research paper documenting that there is actually no long-term challenges to the visual motor system or ocular motor system through the use of VR, and that kids may actually be more resilient than adults. So, this age 10 barrier, I think, is Meta trying to protect themselves from a liability lawsuit if a kid's running around the room with a headset and they trip over something and get injured. I think that's part of it. It's not, I don't think it's really based on science. I'm not talking about kids wearing a headset for 10 hours a day. I'm talking about these kinds of clinical applications. All right, we've got 2 minutes, and I've gotten through maybe 1/10 of the questions I had here for you guys. So maybe we're going to have you back, maybe after you release CogniClear, to talk about that in more detail. But I have one question I always ask all participants, and that is for each of you now. Take 1 minute each. And if you had unlimited funding, you had 2 years, unlimited resources to create a VR application, what would that be? And would it be just an enhancement of what you've already done, or would you tackle a different area?
Uh, one thing that Hossein and I both shared, and you say unlimited funds because we would need this for this particular prospect, is we wanted to create, in fact, physical spaces in which we would be able to have people come in and do their evaluations or play these games, a gym for the mind, have it available in that way. I've always been a fan of location-based entertainment as a critical way to access VR, especially for the general population. That's how I stepped into this profound use case of treating phobias, right? So at least maybe it stems from me, but it was in fact Hossein's idea. And I would certainly try to open up even physical spaces across cities and actually make our service available to people who are walking in.
From my perspective, I think like having unlimited resources is actually not necessarily going to make a lot of change. It's about the experience. You need to have the experience of making mistakes with VR and learning it and going through it. I mean, you see a lot of companies that come out here have 10 times what we have in terms of, resources and not being able to build. It's because you have to go through that pain and you have to go through it. I would prefer to have 2 years of additional experience and being able to have the same resources I have today, but 2 years down the line of where I would have been, and I could probably build a lot more.
Yeah. Hey, well, just to close here, Amir, I know I'm going to see you in Prague in early September for the International Conference on Disability, VR, and Associated Technologies. That we're going to have an industry panel and we're going to talk probably a little bit more about the challenges of business and bringing that into this area, which we didn't get enough time to do, but we will come back and address it. And Hussein, I hope you can turn up as well, because there's a lot of good bars in Prague and they've got some really good dark beer. So I
Nice.
know
Would love to join.
after the conference, Amir and I will for sure be visiting one or two of those. So hopefully you can join us as well. And it's a great
Would love to.
conference too, by the way. If anybody's interested, we'll put a link in the chat on that particular event, which the program has been formalized now, and amazing work being done, good science and good clinical application. So with that, let me pass it off to Sherry and we'll maybe take a look at some of the questions that we have.
Yeah, I want to join you in September. Can I join you?
I'll send you the link. Yep,
Okay,
absolutely.
sounds good. Okay, well, what we want to do now is open it up for a few questions and answers. And just as a reminder, participants who are joining from the webinar can directly ask a question through the Q&A window, while participants from the YouTube live stream can also ask questions in the live chat. And we do have one question that's come in. This is, okay, here's the question. What is your strategy for removing the barrier of requiring a VR device for use to use your product?
You know, when I was a writer for VentureBeat, I was a big proponent for a mode of VR called Web VR, or then it became WebXR, the ability for different people with different devices to be able to access the same world from different ways with limited kind of, interaction, which is 2D, to all the way to full interaction, which is, using a VR headset. And ultimately, it works for so many different mediums. Let's say a social VR app or something like that, the categories that I personally am not interested even in those entertainment kind of categories. When it comes to this, everything that is the basis of our technology, the basis of our value proposition, to the DNA, has to do with the fact that it's VR, that it's embodied, that your nervous system believes that this situation is real. So as far as DNA of our company, we would never venture into creating any product except those like the remote control that are auxiliary. Those can be 2D. But in terms of the actual direct experience of evaluating or serving as a therapeutic for an individual, it needs to hijack your whole body, head to toe.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amir. There's another question here. Have you found any activities that didn't capture your user's attention until you created a VR experience for it? One example that comes to mind is Tai Chi.
I feel like Skip, you should jump in there as well.
Well,
it's a hard one.
I think that this is the other side of the coin of what is the value of VR, and that is that it's not just the ultimate randomized controlled trials documenting efficacy and ultimately effectiveness, which of course you have to have, but VR offers this potential to engage users in things that they might not typically access through traditional methods. So, we see people being more likely to seek treatment for PTSD if offered in a VR format, a VR exposure therapy format. We've got data to document that, that they have more of an interest. We see that special needs populations that traditional methods might not be so appealing or engaging for them. Like say kids on the autism spectrum, we've done job interview training with folks using virtual job interviewers, virtual characters. And there's a number of companies that are doing this now as well. And we find that that population gets engaged in a way where the fear and the anxiety about interacting with a real person is lessened because it's a virtual person. We see in some of our virtual human work that people are more forthcoming and self-disclosing personal information when they're interacting with a virtual support agent or virtual counselor. Not that we're going to be building virtual therapists to eliminate real therapists, but to fill in gaps where there aren't enough therapists. People engage with this software, these software agents, in a way that they might be apprehensive to with a real person. The fear of shame, guilt, being judged, stuff like that. There's a lot of research in that area. So, and come on, probably the biggest use case is in physical rehabilitation. That's the biggest problem in physical therapy after a stroke or traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, is that it's so repetitive, boring, and frustrating to do traditional rehab, even though you need to do that. If you can at least offload some of it to a game-based application that is fun, engaging, gives you feedback, changes up, that's the stuff that engages people in this kind of therapy. And we know in physical therapy, it's kind of almost a linear relationship. The more you do, the better your outcomes are going to be. And the same thing in the cognitive training, I believe. So I really have a strong view that the side of the coin of breaking down barriers to care is just is right up there with documenting the efficacy of the activity. So
Right.
Can I
Thanks.
add something? Can I just
Yeah.
add something real quick? I want to say that I think a lot of the traditional methods have this prerequisite of you having a problem before you even going towards it. And that doesn't necessarily require the need. And what we're doing is a lot more natural. So in a person who just wants to know what, their cognitive state is to become better, not necessarily having a problem for them to want to resolve. I think that's one of the things that we're adding is anyone can use this and benefit from it. It's not that you feel like you have a problem or your child has a problem and then therefore you need to go and utilize this. And that changes the dynamics a lot.
Yeah, that's great, Hossein. That's really an important point. I'm not sure we have enough time to address this completely, but I would love to get your thoughts from all three of you. There's so much discussion around AI and the use of AI within immersive tech. And so what do you see as a role with specifically the Virtuleap applications?
When I was, again, a writer, there's a lot of exciting applications for AI for, let's say, in the side of things of world creation. You could have AI kind of like manifest worlds so fast because it is so time consuming to create environments in VR. Where can AI come and really create spaces in a way that's much more dynamic and quick? And it's a huge problem point that I think it could really address on that end. In terms of our company and our interest, it really comes down to the level of data that Hossein and the team have created in terms of data infrastructure. How can we dig into the data? We have about close to 70,000 registered users. And you imagine we collect about 250,000 data points every 3 minutes of gameplay. Again, a combination of the psychometric data with the physical gesticulation data to the physiological sensors that are in some of the headsets, like pupil dilation tracking. That data set is profoundly, like an order of magnitude greater than anything other systems can capture in one device. So we've really kind of investigated that area. We have one neuroscientist on the team. We need machine learning experts. We need a lot of people to start coming in and creating, let's say, algorithms that can dig into that data set and understand side by side with demographics. What are some insights about your personality, about your temperament? All these things are hidden in that data that I think personally is a very interesting area and angle that AI is definitely needed. For example, correlating our data sets to psychometrics, like the Big Five personality test, being able to connect the dots in ways that you really need to dig deep into the data to be able to get, and perhaps even serve as these what we call digital health biomarkers that could be an early flag of someone that is so deep in the data that tells us maybe in someone's 30s that there's something in their cognitive profile that says maybe they should look into an evaluation much earlier on than, let's say, 20 years from now when things hit the fan. We need to, use AI to leverage the data in a way that is unhuman.
That's great. Hossein, do you have anything to add to that? We've got just a minute left.
Yeah, I think AI is basically going to be a assistant to, at least for the next year or two, for our team. It's going to be an assistant to accelerate things, to be able to process data quicker and be able to do certain elements, touch points. We're not necessarily going to be relying on AI for a full scale of a workflow, but we will be implementing it on certain sections of our workflow just to speed it up. At this point, I think that's what we can benefit from AI.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, I think we're near the end right now. And so I want to once again say thank you for joining our first episode of Immersive Tech Talk. Hope you've learned from our amazing guests today. And I just want to say thank you, Amir, Hossein, and of course, thank you to our incredible host, Skip Rizzo. For our audience, the video recordings of this event will be available on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to share it with anyone who might be interested in the topic. We look forward to seeing you again at our next event and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again.